welcome to the Why We Argue podcast. I'm Robert Talisse, your host. I'm professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. Why We Argue is produced by Humility and Conviction in Public Life, a project based at the University of Connecticut, which explores how to balance our deepest commitments with open-mindedness, a respect for reason, and intellectual humility. The series, which is made possible by generous funding from the John Templeton Foundation, features brief discussions with publicly minded thinkers about the state of civil discourse in contemporary democracy. Today, my guest is Eric Alterman. Eric is CUNY Distinguished Professor of English and Journalism at Brooklyn College. Eric is also a columnist for The Nation and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington and the World Policy Institute in New York. He's the author of several books, including What Liberal Media?, When Presidents Lie, Kabuki Democracy, and most recently, Inequality and One City. Hello, Eric.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
I'll live.
Thanks for joining me for a discussion on the Why We Argue podcast. Why don't we just hit right into it? Eric, the presidential election, including the campaign leading up to it and the subsequent months following the election, have been strange by anyone's measure, I think. And they've involved episodes in which the role of the news media has been overtly called into question, and sometimes stronger even challenged and criticized. The claim that mainstream news sources are biased and fake is common, and the perceived reliability of outlets that in fact are bound by no journalistic norms seems to be on the rise. Now, one part of the diagnosis of all this is that we tend to, as thinkers, we tend to view information that confirms our pre-existing views as objective and as reliable, and we also tend to dismiss countervailing information and to disregard sources of countervailing information and often see them as unreliable. But arguably, the news media is supposed to help us counteract these tendencies by supplying us with a reliable, objective, balanced source of political information and other kinds of information. What do you make of all this?
You said a mouthful.
Yes.
But I tell you, I have some problems with the way you pose these questions to me.
Great.
I'll tell you why. Number one, you kept saying the media is, and that's Englishly incorrect, grammatically incorrect, and profoundly misleading in a very important way. There is no the media. There are many, many different kinds of media, and you can't speak about the media without being right about one of them and wrong about most of them. Number two, you spoke in the passive voice a few times, which means that you weren't willing to attribute your criticisms to a particular source, which is very important to know who the source is in order to judge the claims. The third thing you did was use the word seems more than once. And whenever anyone says seems, I have this Pavlovian reaction. I do it to my students all the time. Seems, madam, nay, it is. I know not seems. Act 1, Scene 2, I believe, of Hamlet, which means that you can say anything you want if you use the word seems. Seems to me that there's no such thing as global warming because it was cold yesterday, you know? So when you talk about the media, the most important thing to do, in my view, is define your terms. Which media do you mean when you want to discuss it or criticize it? And number two, when you talk about criticism of the media, again, you need to identify the source of the criticism because there's an awful lot of perfectly fair-minded and sensible criticism to be made of many different media sources, but there's an awful lot of purely political hackery that's designed to obfuscate the truth, and that's actually more common than not.
So let me ask a question then. So the way that we individuate different media, is that, in your mind, by means of their platform? Is there, is news media that comes by way of print a different media from news media that comes by way of screens or by audio, or do you have a different kind of way of individuating different media?
Well, I have a spectrum of reliability that I begin my semester with when I teach my students, that begins with hearsay. I always quote something my mother's Aunt Rose heard on a bus as the beginning of the spectrum. Someone told her not to buy from Radio Shack. Not her, someone else.
Right.
She heard someone else on the bus tell someone else not to buy from Radio Shack because they were a ripoff. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is refereed journals. Although I would actually put the New Yorker magazine slightly beyond that, having been through their fact-checking process. I really would.
Right.
And in between is everything else. And everything else falls on the spectrum depending on the particular case of that media institution. There are books which are footnoted, but not necessarily but they have no obligation to be true. They just have an obligation not to be suable. Mm-hmm. The publishers don't fact check anything. They just lawyer them. So books are footnoted, but it's up to the person reading them to decide upon the reliability, which is usually based on the individual author's reputation. There are magazines which are fact checked and magazines which are not. Most magazines are not, but some are. But even those that are, the fact-checking process is itself problematic because they're fact-checked by sources that are not themselves fact-checked. Then there's daily newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, that try very hard to get things right, but they've only got a day to do it in, and they make a lot of mistakes. But they care about their reputation. Then there's I'm moving backwards on the spectrum now.
Right.
Then there's cable news, which only cares. It doesn't really care if what is being said is true or not. It cares again if what is being said can get it into trouble, and if someone's going to complain about it, if someone powerful is going to complain. But if someone unpowerful is going to complain, then it's not a problem. Then you move to different sources on the internet, which don't care if they're true at all because they have no particular reputation for truth to defend. Again, it's a matter of getting sued. And then some publications that you can't even identify, that you have no idea who they are, that are just making stuff up for the sake of hits. Those have always been around, but they've become kind of an epidemic, or people started to notice them in the last election. And according to some studies that have been published, that was the majority of news that appeared on Facebook. And the big problem that we're facing now, that is brand new, is that it used to be that people would choose the media that they would consume, and it would be as credible as they wanted it to be. If you read the National Enquirer, it was not terribly credible, but you probably knew that, or you didn't care. If you read the New York Times, you did care. If you read the New York Review of Books, you cared even more. But now most people, particularly most young people, but most people get their news through social media. And it's hard to distinguish what the source is. And so all media sources appear equally believable or not believable. And therefore, like Gresham's law, bad information chases out good information.
Right. So the different media then are distinguished according to the ways in which they're both committed to and held to standards of reliability.
Correct.
Great. So I take it then it's a real problem if you're correct, and I believe that you are, that especially in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, but certainly since the lead up to the last election, political news in particular seems to be becoming more commonly consumed on online sources that don't seem to have any accountability. Is that right?
That seems twice in that sentence. Yeah, well, online news, it's not online. The problem is not online. I consume 95%, actually 100% of my news online, except for I do get a few paper. Well, I guess some of it's on paper, but the same articles I read on paper are also online. Right. I never watch television news. I don't think it adds anything at all. And I don't watch the pundit programs because if something significant happens with them, I can find it online. But I go to a lot of trouble to determine the source of what I'm learning from. And most people have no reason to do that. They're not professionals. They're just consumers, and they're not particular consumers. So yeah, but the problem is not. I guess you could say that the thing about online sources is that it's easier to hide who's providing them. And the guy who was interviewed by the Washington Post, who's got a fake news site in Yugoslavia, or what used to be Yugoslavia, he said right-wingers are really dumb and they'll believe anything, whereas liberals won't. And therefore, it's really easy to fool right-wingers into thinking things like that it's somehow imaginable that Hillary Clinton would be running a child porn in a pizza parlor, child porn place in a pizza parlor. I mean, that's just idiotic. But some people believe it, and there's some disturbed person brought a gun to it. Now, I wouldn't say these sources are any worse than talk radio was. Alex Jones and Rush Limbaugh make things up all the time. They're venal. They do it knowingly. And they do it for the purpose of confusing and enraging people. It's just that you know who they are. And somebody, like their advertisers, I suppose, or their producers, can be asked to take responsibility for them. Although, let's be honest, as long as they make a lot of money for these people, there isn't much responsibility taken. The problem with online sources, and particularly with Facebook refusing to take any responsibility, it's that it's become much more common. But it's never not been there.
And doesn't it move, though, more fluidly in that?
I don't know that Martin Luther's 92 theses were all true. 95 theses?
Right.
I don't know that they were all true, They were read by a lot of people. They took advantage of the printing press. I don't think that they were all true.
But doesn't the media, and now I just mean the platform, the delivery system.
Yeah. That would be the medium, no?
The medium, yes. Doesn't the medium allow for a kind of fluidity and a speed of dissemination that makes a difference? In that it exacerbates the problem, and if you got to go and print.
We had this event. It seems like a long time ago already, when there was this woman in the Department of Agriculture who was set up by Breitbart people named Shirley Sherrod, who gave a speech, and the speech was then edited by the Breitbart people. James O'Keefe was the alleged filmmaker is the wrong word. He was the hitman, and he edited it to have her saying exactly the opposite of what it was she was saying. But calls for comments were made that day by various cable outfits, and Obama's Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, fired her so that he could say she was fired by the time the cable news came on that afternoon. And then weeks later, it became apparent that the tape had been doctored and she didn't say these things. And I don't remember whether or not she got her. That was already... that was 7 or 8 years ago. Now that has speeded up much more quickly because, as I said, the news now travels almost exclusively on the internet. The cable stations chew on it, but they don't break much of it. And so the speed is a problem. But I would say that Shirley Sherrod example is a pretty good example of a problem. The cable news, in the political world, the cable news stations kind of still run things, because they spend all day speaking to political junkies, and particularly the people who work in politics. And they define the parameters of the discourse. So if you can get into them, then you've really achieved something. That's without them, I think it's obvious. I don't think anyone would argue there would be no Donald Trump presidency if CNN and Fox had not fallen, and MSNBC actually as well, had not fallen in love with this spectacle of Donald Trump. It wouldn't have worked just on the internet.
Right. And does the speed or the rapidity or the way in which reportage gets disseminated these days, does that contribute to, does that incentivize spectacle making in politics? I mean, it seems that let me put it this way. One could argue that what Trump has been a master of is sort of leading the news stations around by creating things that need to be reported, even if the report's content is that the president has said something very strange, or the president has alleged something that would be amazing if true. That takes over the news cycle, the fact that something has been said, even if it has no merit.
Trump is a genius. I mean, and when I say a genius, I don't necessarily mean he's intelligent. I mean he's a genius. They're two separate things. Trump is a genius for the manipulation and exploitation of the weaknesses of the mainstream media. You're right that he creates these shiny objects that they can't help but chase, even if they hate themselves in the morning. And he does it. I think he kind of does it without even. He doesn't do it strategically. He just does it. Like, that's his genius. And it's because he's an entertainer and an egomaniac, and he always needs attention to be focused on him, and he has no filters. And the media have for a long time, the mainstream media have basically been mindless. In other words, they would report anything without taking a position on it. That's one of the problems with objectivity, is that it doesn't require any commitment to truth. It just requires that things be reported from quote unquote both sides. So Trump has exploited that by, one side says Barack Obama was born in Kenya. One side says it doesn't. He wasn't. You be the one to decide. That's a perfectly respectable, objective report. McCarthy pioneered this technique, and Trump has taken it into hyperspace and perfected it, so that now it's a daily part of our lives.
So what can the media do? I mean, if what alternative what alternative to that, the norm of objectivity as you just described it, which is just not committing to any norm of truth, but simply reporting the facts where the facts are what people say or what people have claimed or asserted is the truth. What's an alternative role for the media?
Well, again, you can't talk about the media.
I'm sorry.
No, really. I mean, the thing is that I think I argued in my very first book, Sound and Fury, which coined the term punditocracy, if I do say so myself, which is now in the OED.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Very proud of that. And they use my name in the example.
Excellent.
So I'm going to live forever. I argued that we needed a more European form of journalism where they say, here's what, you read a newspaper that you agree with, whether it's Le Monde or Libération or a conservative newspaper, and they tell you the truth, and they don't feel like they have to say on the one hand and on the other hand, you decide. They are able to tell you the truth. The Guardian does this too. They should be fair and balanced, actually. But they shouldn't be afraid to say this guy's lying and this guy's telling the truth, or this person has a convincing argument and here's why this other person isn't convincing argument. Ironically, everything in my life ends up being the opposite of what it should be. Fox News, first talk radio and then right-wing talk radio, and then Fox News adopted this model, and they did it by not caring particularly about what was true. They did it as a political onslaught on the center and the left. And it proved to be very popular. So others, CNN and other sources, started to copy it because that's where the cable news audience was. It's just and talk radio audiences. It's just a sort of weird, unfortunate fact that to make money in television news and radio news, only right wingers are the real market for it. And liberals, they want both sides. That's why NPR is what liberals get, and NPR is as conservative as it is liberal in terms of the nature of its commentary and most of its news. The only way you could define NPR as the liberal is by comparing it to conservatives, quote unquote conservative. But the conservatives are not conservative; they're not truthful. because they're doing something else. Fox News is not a news station. It's a propaganda network that is actually the tail wagging the dog. The Republican Party has to respond to Fox News, not the other way around.
Right.
So we're in a weird situation where one side is trying to uphold values that the other side, for which the other side has no respect or can even recognize anymore. And we reached a tipping point in this election because Trump got 60 million votes without anybody really being able to believe him. I mean, it's impossible to believe the things Trump said in the campaign. It's just impossible. They're contradictory and they defy logic. But people didn't care because the facts ceased to matter. People just wanted to vote the ad.
Excellent. And the sloganeering was pretty remarkable too. In that leading up to the election, it was hard to find a dominant interpretation of any of the Trump slogans. So draining the swamp and making America great again were vague enough that anybody can fit in any content that they favored. And so they worked like marketing slogans rather than like political proposals.
Look, no Republican candidate for Senate or president in the past 12 years has run on a program that says global warming is real, it's man-made, and it's a threat that needs to be addressed. Not one. And yet every single other country doesn't have a major party that takes that position because it's not an intellectually defensible position. When 99.7% of qualified climatologists say the opposite, you don't get to say it's not if you don't have any evidence, which they don't. And yet the entire Republican Party takes that position. So truth is not a question in there, but the mainstream media can't bring themselves to say all these people are ignoring truth. They have to say on the one hand, on the other hand. They might in the very last paragraph say, by the way, there's not much scientific support for this position. But that's not the focus of what comes across. I mean, just the day before yesterday, Donald Trump lifted the regulations on pollution from cars that Obama had put into place. Those stories didn't say, oh, by the way, this is based on a theory that no respectable scientist really in the Western world agrees and no political party agrees with. They just reported it, here's the news. No context. So somebody wrote a book now, I think it was George W.S. Trill, if I'm not mistaken, called In the Context of No Context. But I might be wrong about who wrote that. And that's where we're living. And in the context of no context, you can say anything you want. And because so many people live in this world, Trump got 60 million votes. The rest of the media have to pay heed to it, to be respectful of it, to not insult these people every day because they're accused of being unpatriotic and liberally biased. And also they want some of the same dough that Fox is bringing in. Fox is making $1 billion a year. So it's a big problem, and I don't have any idea how to solve it.
Well, do you have any advice that you might, or any lessons that we should take away as citizens who for those citizens who are trying their level best to make sense of the political world and are relying on certain media outlets, certain kinds of media outlets to help them do
I do, yeah. At the same time this is happening, and it's not entirely unrelated, the economic model of the newspaper business has collapsed. And so there are 40% fewer newspaper reporters and editors working today than there were 10 years ago. And print advertising in newspapers is metastasizing in terms of its disappearance. So people need to pay for good news sources. Good news is very expensive to produce, And the internet has trained people not to pay for it. Facebook and Craigslist have been devastating to the business model that people have relied on forever to support newspapers. And I'd say probably 90% of the reliable news we get comes from newspaper reporting. So people need to find those sources that they support, just like the churches they support and the political organizations they support, and support news sources because they can't support themselves. And, who knows what will happen over the next 4 or 8 years, but truth is not going to stop mattering. I'm actually writing another book about presidential lying now. And the fact that he lies so much is a problem for Donald Trump. It's not nothing. It's crazy the degree to which he lies, and he lies so often you can't keep up with them. But some of the lies end up mattering when the truth is found out, and you can't predict which ones will. And that's really our only hope. So I think that I don't say this often enough, but people really need to support reliable media because they're under so many different threats now that they're just not going to make it. There's going to be like half a dozen to a dozen reliable news sources left in the next 10 years if people don't change their attitude. Totally.
And by reliable, do you mean newspapers particularly? I mean,
particularly newspapers, because those are the ones under the most threat. But I'm not limiting it to newspapers. Anything that you trust and is actually going out there and seeking information. It's not just like, you shouldn't give your money to me personally because I don't discover anything. I explain things, and I'm relying on those same people who are discovering things. But we need people to go out there and discover things and to be watchdogs, and that's what we're losing. The cable stations, which are now making money hand over fist, they don't provide this service. They're just entertainment stations that use politics as entertainment. Nothing is ever discovered by these people. So we need the discoverers to be supported.
Well, Eric Alterman, thank you so much for talking today on the Why We Argue podcast. That seems like a good piece of advice to end on. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to the Why We Argue podcast, which I remind you is produced by the University of Connecticut's Humility and Conviction in Public Life Project with generous support from the John Templeton Foundation. You can follow the project on Twitter and on Facebook at Public Humility. That's one word, Public Humility. Thank you so much, and bye for now.